So when we talk about Nahum, which we can speak a bit provocative here about the gospel of God's rage, Nahum focuses on God being good, and God being good means God is at war against evil. And God defeats evil. He will be successful. Nahum focuses on Nineveh, but that defeat of evil, of course, has come in a number of other ways, and we'll briefly look this morning at Isaiah 52 and Romans 10 to conclude our reflections on Nahum. But first, a few more pictures of Assyrian violence and propaganda. So there's the physical violence that God deals with by bringing in by the destruction of Nineveh and bringing the Assyrian Empire to an end. And there's the rhetorical violence, the propaganda that God deals with through the prophecy of Nahum. And so one of the things that Nahum reminds us of is that there's a war of hearts and minds to be won as well. And that war is thought with words and in the imagination. And that's why he uses powerful imagery and poetry in that war. So here we see another image of, these are Assyrian reliefs, so they are not afraid to show off their violence. Here beating up their prisoners. And it's a scene of some eagle or something taking away a captive. And the question is, where's God in all this violence? And one part of the answer comes in Nineveh, in Nahum, with the defeat of Nineveh. This beautiful, powerful, majestic city torn apart, wrecked in the defeat. And got some nice images for one of the key images being used. Here we have the Assyrian king fighting a lion. I'm not sure that's a realistic picture, but that's how they would like you to see them. It's this courageous king grabbing the lion on his neck. But in fact, Nineveh will be like that lion, defeated. That's kind of a sad image of a lion. I did think at one point, but it did take too long, the production of this commentary and so on. I had a student who was very good at drawing, and he said, I can do you some drawings of those, and you can include them in the commentary. But those commentaries don't usually have pictures and stuff, so it's all a bit complicated. But I would have loved to include something of this in my commentary. And here the final image of blood getting vomited out, this lion. So that's what the Assyrians thought they did to others, and that's what's being done to them according to Nahum's prophecy. So to Isaiah 52, where we have an echo of one of the verses of Nahum, which you'll be familiar with. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Now, it's not a salvation that comes from the destruction of Nineveh that brings liberation for all the nations in that neighborhood. But now, as you see here, this is applied to the fall of the next kingdom, the empire, the Babylonian Empire, which gives liberation for the Judean exiles. Depart, depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of it, purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of the Lord. For you shall not go out in haste, you shall not go out in flight. So it's not like the Exodus, It's more relaxed than that. It's a new Exodus, but even better. You don't have to run. The Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. So another announcement of peace, another defeat of evil as the exiles are going back to the land. But there is now a development, of course, because while in Nahum it's the evil is basically just the violence done by an oppressor, and there's maybe an element of that in Isaiah 52, but there's a reason why the people of God were in exile. It was their sin. And so the greater evil that needs to be dealt with is the sin. And so this then moves famously, of course, into those passages into Isaiah 53. See, my servant shall prosper, he shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. And then you know Isaiah 53, that God deals with the greatest evil on the cross. And so it's entirely appropriate that this verse features in the New Testament as well, Romans 10. For one believes with the heart, and so is justified, and one confesses with the mouth, and so is saved. The scripture says, no one who believes in him will be put to shame. No one. For there's no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and is generous to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim it? Well, you need a messenger again. So, as it is written, how are they to proclaim unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. So the good news that are being brought today are the good news about the defeat of evil on the cross. And that's, of course, when we preach on, it's the case also when we preach on Nahum. We don't bring to our congregations the good news that Nineveh has been destroyed in 612 BC. People think, well, yeah, what's the big deal? Lots of cities have been destroyed in the history. What's the good news for us in there? No, Nineveh is a paradigm for evil. And so when we preach about God's defeat of evil, then we do so with reference to the cross as well, where evil is crossed out. So what we see in Nahum, where the emphasis lies, is that God is patient, but he doesn't sweep evil under the carpet. God tolerates evil, but not forever. And that's the same that we find on the cross. In Acts we read, God has been patient, ignoring the sins for many generations. But on the cross, he finally condemns evil. And we talk a little bit more about how that's fulfilled later on. But how is the original prophecy fulfilled? In Zephaniah, we have another prophecy along those lines. He will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and he will make Nineveh a desolation, a dry waste like the desert. Zephaniah has a much bigger canvas, talks about many more different things. So that's just one verse, that in Nahum is a whole book, how God would stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. But this tells us that Zephaniah, like Nahum, prophesied before the destruction of Nineveh in 612, while Habakkuk, I'm convinced, prophesied afterwards. So that's Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, not in chronological order, Zephaniah earlier than Habakkuk. But how did God do that? How did he stretch out his hand against the north and destroyed Assyria? How did he make Nineveh a desolation? And interesting that it uses here the language of a dry waste like the desert, because you remember in Nahum, it uses the image of all flooded, the opposite image. But they're not contradicting each other because they're both using symbolic language. They're not debating whether the destruction of Nineveh will involve a lot of dryness or a lot of water. Nahum uses the water imagery for chaos, and Zephaniah uses the desert imagery for desolation. And they amount to the same thing, but using different symbols for it. How did God do that? Well, to explore that, I want to sneak in a little bit of the major prophets, Jeremiah, because I think that leads us nicely into Habakkuk. So here, book of Jeremiah, chapter 21, verse 2. Please inquire of the Lord on our behalf, for King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is making war against us. Perhaps the Lord will perform a wonderful deed for us, as he has often done, and will make him withdraw from us. Turns out that Nebuchadnezzar is that wonderful deed, with that massive success that he had. This is what it looks like on a map. Here we are, the Assyrian Empire. You remember that map at its greatest extent, even including Egypt under its control. And then we have in Chaldea the rise of an alternative power, the Babylonians or Chaldeans. They are supported by the Medians in alliance, and in 612 they destroy Nineveh. That's not quite the end of the Assyrian Empire yet. The Assyrians withdraw to the north, but they are pursued by the Babylonian and Median forces. There's another major battle 2 years later in Haran, and that really changes the landscape. Now it becomes the Babylonian Empire, because in 5 years later, the Egyptians come and help the Assyrians, because the Egyptians think a weak Assyrian state is better than a strong Babylonian one. And this is the famous incident, or reasonably famous, I think, where the Pharaoh Necho comes up, and of course, in order to help the Assyrians, he has to go through Judah and Israel, and he meets Josiah. He meets the Judean king in 6. It is Josiah, isn't it? Yeah. And something goes wrong in their communication, so he gets killed. And Pharaoh continues further on. And even though with the Egyptian support, they are defeated, and the Egyptian troops have to withdraw, the Assyrians are defeated in Carchemish, one of the most famous battles in the ancient world, in 605. And that finishes the Assyrian Empire forever. But I want to explore that question a bit more theologically, I suppose, juxtaposing here verse 2 and verse 5 of Jeremiah 21. So in Jeremiah 21, verse 2, we read, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is making war against us. Then in verse 5, the same language, making war, is used, but now it's I, God. I myself will make war against you with outstretched hand and mighty arm, in anger, in fury, and in great wrath. This is, by the way, addressed to Judah. It's not to Nineveh, but it's the same principle, it's the same campaign. Nebuchadnezzar is waging war, and yet God says, I make war against you. And that's not a coincidence, that use of the same verb, because it happens here all the time. Verse 6, I will strike down the inhabitants of this city, says God. Both human beings and animals, they shall die of a great pestilence. But then in verse 7 it says, I will give King Zedekiah of Judah and his servants and the people in this city into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He shall strike them down. Same verb used again. So Nebuchadnezzar does the striking down, but God says, I will strike down. And by the way, you may know that in Jeremiah uses the Nebuchadnezzar form with the R, which is the more correct form actually, but we got used to the one with N. further on in verse 7, and he shall not pity them, Nebuchadnezzar, he shall not pity them or spare them or have compassion, which echoes what God said earlier in the book in chapter 13, I will not pity or spare or have compassion when I destroy them, using the very same words. So I think you begin to see the principle of that. We've got he shall not pity, and that's translated theologically into I shall not pity, God says. Or we could put it the other way around. God says, I will not spare, and it translates into Nebuchadnezzar will not spare them. Nebuchadnezzar will not have any compassion. God says, I will not have compassion. A particularly striking thing, given that compassion is one of his characteristics. But in this particular event, there will be no compassion from God. So verse 8 puts it together, in a way, those two parallel tracks. If any nation or kingdom will not serve this king, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, I don't know whether that's a mistake in my translation or whether Jeremiah happens to use the N here, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, then I will punish that nation with the sword, with famine, and with pestilence, says the Lord, until I have completed its destruction by his hand. So how did he do it? God brings destruction at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and his armies. That's maybe kind of a little footnote, similar to a saying that you may have heard that's widely attributed to St. Teresa of Avila. I don't think she ever said it, but well, that's what people now say. Christ has no body now on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the feet by which he is to go about doing good, and yours are the hands by which he is to bless us now. I'm not entirely comfortable with that. It's a slight overstatement, I think. But there is a strong element of truth. How does Christ act today? He acts primarily through his body, the church. So when we meet, when we get compassion from a brother or sister in Christ, we receive Christ's compassion. And that is why abuse of any sort or bullying within church is such a particularly horrendous thing. Because it is like saying, this is Christ doing it. Like God used Nebuchadnezzar for this violence. What is it telling now about Christ? So a bit more on how this works. How did he do it? So God has a plan and purpose in relation to the nations, which he exercises through Nebuchadnezzar. He commissions Nebuchadnezzar and he says, you're the one, not that Nebuchadnezzar even knew that, but you're the one who's going to subdue this region. And as part of that whole campaign that ends the Assyrian Empire, that brings a lot of other countries under Babylonian domain, you will destroy Jerusalem. And that is like saying God is doing it. God is bringing destruction on Jerusalem and is bringing everything under the Babylonian domain. And we see that dynamic on the cross as well. What happened on the cross? Who condemned Jesus? Who put Jesus on the cross? And again, we can answer that in different ways. You know, obviously, Jesus was condemned by the high priest, the Sanhedrin, the council. He was put on the cross by the Roman authorities. But there's also a sense in which God is behind that. God has done what the law weakened by the flesh could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and to deal with sin, he condemned sin in the flesh. The New Testament would never go as far as to say God condemned Jesus. God condemned sin in the flesh. And the New Testament doesn't say God put Jesus on the cross. But what happened there, what the Sanhedrin did, what the Roman authorities did, was of course according to the plan and purpose of God from before eternity. And so God is responsible for it. But there is a mystery related to that complicates matters, both in the Old Testament situation and I think in the New Testament situation. In Zechariah, we're going to read, sadly we won't have time really for Zechariah. I'm extremely angry with the nations that are these, for while I was only a little angry, they made the disaster worse. So if God had had his way perfectly, according to his good intentions, the violence would not have worked out the way it did. It ended up all messier, bloodier, more violent than God, in some sense, would have wanted. Now, in Reformed theology, we talk about the two wills of God, in a way, to try and make sense of that. Of course, in some sense, and he does take responsibility for it, it is in his overall sovereignty and purpose, but it's not, in another sense, what he truly wanted. They made a disaster worse. Yes, so we'll come to that in a moment, because in Nahum, with chapter 1, it's all kind of God's focus on God, and then chapter 2 and 3, we get a picture of the different armies, but we're never told who the instrument is. It's not important in him, so he doesn't focus on Nebuchadnezzar. We know it's Nebuchadnezzar and his armies, but they're only described for what they do. Now, going a bit forward, we realize that, well, the Babylonians are just as bad as the Assyrians. And that is exactly Habakkuk's problem. He says, how is that working? You're punishing evil with an idolater who is just as bad. And so when we come to Habakkuk, that's exactly the issue that he's addressing. So when we ask now, who's responsible for this evil thing that has happened, the destruction of cities, or the evil thing that happened on the cross because there was a great injustice, then we can think of it at one level that God is doing something to the nations here. So that means, reversing the arrow, that the nations can address God as responsible for it. Because God uses Nebuchadnezzar as an instrument, so God can be addressed. And that's why Habakkuk then, when the Babylonians cause all that havoc, doesn't send an ambassador to King Nebuchadnezzar and says, you're evil, you should be more restrained and so on. No, he complains to God. He makes God responsible for it. Because God is the one who uses Nebuchadnezzar as his instrument. But because God uses Nebuchadnezzar as his instrument, there's also a level of responsibility that's to do with Nebuchadnezzar. But that's directly to do with God. So the nations are able to make God responsible for it, but God makes Nebuchadnezzar responsible for what he does because he's Nebuchadnezzar's instrument. So I summed up in the next slide. God takes responsibility for what happened through his agents, but his agents remain responsible to him. Now, I usually compare it to, say, if you go to the bank and the clerk makes a mistake and he doesn't give you enough money or deducts too much money, and you go home, you realize, you go back, you've got an issue with the bank. Your issue that needs to be sorted out is with the bank. And the bank manager will need to take responsibility for that. It's not just between you and the clerk. So you've got to sort it out with the bank needs to sort it out with you. But the bank manager will surely have a word with the clerk. So the bank takes responsibility. The bank will not be able to say, sorry, nothing to do with you, with us. It's just this one person who did that. No, they will need to take responsibility for it because that clerk is their employee. And so in the same way, God takes responsibility for what happens through his agents, even if the things that are happening through his agents are things that he didn't really want to happen somehow. If they make mistakes, if they make the disaster worse, if they bring a lot of violence, he says, yeah, I brought this violence. I take responsibility for that because they are my agents. But then he has a word with the agents as well, and they are responsible. So let's have a look at a prophecy that brings it closer to home for Judah. Now that Israel, the northern kingdom, has been gone for a while, it becomes possible in prophetic literature to call the people of God Israel again. In Jeremiah, it's a bit mixed. Sometimes Israel refers to the northern people and sometimes to the whole people. Behold, I am bringing against you a nation from afar, O house of Israel, speech of the Lord. An enduring nation is he. A nation from of old is he. A nation whose language you do not know, nor can you understand what he says. His quiver is like an open grave. All of them are heroes. And he will devour your harvest and your food. They will devour your sons and your daughters. He will devour your flocks and your herds. He will devour your vines and your fig trees. He will demolish with the sword your fortified cities in which you trust. So this is Jeremiah 5, 15 to 17. A prophecy announcing that Nebuchadnezzar, well, it's not actually named here, but we will know soon enough. It's the Babylonians that will cause absolute havoc in Judah and make an end to it. And I want to add a little bit more from chapter 4, and you see in a moment why. At that time, the people of Judah and Jerusalem will be told, a scorching wind will sweep down from the hilltops in a desert on my dear people. So that's quite a familiar image in Israel. If the wind comes from the west, it's a cool breeze, might even bring rain because it comes from the Mediterranean. If it comes from the hills in the east, or if it comes from the south, it's what in Hebrew they call a kamsin, or what internationally sometimes called a scirocco for the Italian words. It becomes a very hot desert wind. It's just fascinating. When I lived in Israel, sometimes had a duty to wipe the floor with water, and so you could go through the floor, and you could see it dry immediately. But what is great? You make it all wet, and it dries up immediately because there's kamsin around. It's a hot, scorching wind. But of course, it can be quite unpleasant if you don't have the resources in those days to keep cool. Look, he advances like the clouds. His chariots come like a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. This is your doom. How bitter it is. My anguish, how long must I see the standard, so the military standard of the Babylonians, and hear the sound of the trumpet that announces the war? So that's Jeremiah. Why do I go to Jeremiah here? Because I believe and I argue that this feeds into Habakkuk. These phrases, a scorching wind, his horses are swifter than eagles, the bitterness, how long must I see, they will all come up in Habakkuk as well. So, over to Habakkuk. Habakkuk. It begins with how long? How long, O Lord, do I shout for help, but you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, but you will not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and trouble? You look on while destruction and violence are before me. While it happened that strife and contention arose. That is why the law, Torah, is numbed, paralyzed, and justice never comes forth. Because the wicked surrounds the righteous. That is why justice comes forth perverted. So immediately we see it's another unusual prophetic book. Just like Jonah is unusual in that it's a story rather than any kind of oracles much. So Habakkuk is unusual, and it begins with a prayer. And we get an insight here in the prayer that it's not a first prayer. How long do I shout for help? So it seems Habakkuk has been praying for some time. And Martin Luther assumes, and I think he may well be right on that, Habakkuk had been preaching for some time, as well as praying, and it just didn't go anywhere. And so finally he comes with this prayer to God. I'm shouting for help and I don't get any reply. Don't you see what the situation is like? The violence, the destruction is so big. The wicked are so much in charge that Torah, your law, is completely useless, numbed, paralyzed. There's no justice anymore. And probably the one thing everyone knows about Habakkuk is the righteous shall live by faith, picked up by Paul. Now, I think one reason why Paul particularly latches on to Habakkuk 2:4 is because of Habakkuk 1:4 as well. Because all this comes in the context of the law is powerless. And that's, of course, something that Paul also observes. In another context, the law is also powerless to do this, to make us right before God. Here, the law is powerless to make people right before other people, even, because there's so much violence. The law is good, but if it's in the hand of wicked people, it's not going to bring forth justice. How long is this going to be the situation that justice comes forth perverted? Now, the most common reading of the book of Habakkuk is that Habakkuk here looks at Judean society that is deeply corrupt and complains about it. So the injustice is primarily or exclusively Judean injustice. And then in verse 5, God responds to that by saying, I'm going to deal with it. I bring the Babylonians. I'm not alone in this, but we're in a minority, believe that's not true. I think Habakkuk 1:5-11 is not God's answer to the complaint in verse 4, and I'm going to explain that in a moment in a little bit more detail. So the question is, how long is justice going to be denied? And I believe that justice is denied because there is wickedness in Judah, no doubt about it, but also there is already oppression from the Babylonians. That means they're not free to let God's law do its work. So is Habakkuk 1:5-11 God's answer? Here are sort of my top reasons why I think it's not. Look at the nations and observe, and astonish yourselves, be astonished. So first observation, this is in the plural. So he's not addressing Habakkuk. That's not an insurmountable problem, but it's a signal that maybe there's something else going on here. That God isn't saying, look, Habakkuk, this is what I'm going to do. He uses immediately the plural. He does not address the complaint. Verses 5-11 does not address the complaint. Maybe you should read it at first. Look at the nations and observe, and astonish yourselves. Be astonished. For one is about to do a deed in your days that you would not believe if it were told. For look, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the sharp and swift nation, one going across the length and breadth of the earth to take possessions of dwellings not his own. He's dread-inspiring and fearsome. It is from him that his justice and exaltation comes forth. And faster than leopards are his deeds, and quicker than wolves at dusk. And his cavalry is restless, and his cavalry comes from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. All of them come to do violence. The mass of their faces is directed forward, and he gathers captives like sand. It's easy to him. He scoffs at the kings, and rulers are an object of derision to him. He laughs at every fortified city. He piles up dust and captures it. Then he sweeps along a wind and passes through and transgresses. He whose strength is for his God. So that whole section is just saying how bad it is. It is at no point saying, I will punish the injustice, or I will punish the violence that is in Judah. It is saying, he will bring violence. He will bring his justice, not God's justice. It's his justice that comes forth. He transgresses. So he's not described as an instrument for God so much as someone who does wrong. Now, why would God in his answer not talk to the wrongness in Judah, but emphasize the wrongness of the Babylonians and what they do? So that, to me, doesn't really fit properly. Yes, there could be an interesting parallel that God's answer to Job is not really directly addressing the question, although I think God's answer is addressing Job's complaint more than this addresses Habakkuk's complaint. But that would be one possibility of reading it. And I think we are conditioned to read it as God's answer, because in most of our Bibles, we're even given the additional headings that suggest it's God's answer. So we're so used to it that feels like our natural reading. But I'm saying that because there's sort of various signals. If you take just one of them, it might not be enough reason, but that Habakkuk is not addressed, that a complaint is not addressed, and that a complaint makes no difference. By which I mean, when we come to verse 12, Habakkuk's complaint continues just as before. If you compare verse 12 to 17 with verses 2 to 4, there's no development. It's not like if Habakkuk said there's great injustice in Judah, and then God answers, you know what, I'm going to bring greater injustice with the Babylonians. You would expect Habakkuk to say, how is that going to help? But he just continues with his earlier complaint. Are you not from of old, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We should not die. And we'll read that a bit later on. So I'm reading verses 5 to 11 not as God's answer, but as Habakkuk's evidence for the complaint. So Habakkuk complains to God about justice being denied, about the violence in the city, and he says, implicitly, you are responsible for it, and here's the proof. Habakkuk 1, 5 to 11 is the proof that God is responsible because he's the one who brought the Babylonians. So Habakkuk 1, 5 to 11 is, in that sense, rhetorically the earliest part of the book around which the complaint originates. It's an earlier oracle that proves that God is responsible for this violence. And it's actually, I think, an oracle it speaks about the Babylonians as God's fishermen in verse 15. Maybe I should read the continuation of the complaint in that third. Oh yeah, because this does relate to the big, so I'm moving slightly ahead. An earlier oracle that is actually based on Jeremiah, I think. So Habakkuk knows Jeremiah 4 and 5. He knows that the Babylonians are God's instrument. And because of all the violence they bring and the injustice, he prays to God and he makes God responsible because he knows from Jeremiah 4 and 5 that God is responsible for it. And he uses the very language of Jeremiah 4 and 5. Only he twists the oracle a bit to bring out the badness of the Babylonians. And then he continues with that acknowledgement that the Babylonians are God's fishermen. Are you not from of old, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We should not die. O Lord, for justice you established him. And, O Rock, to adjudicate you founded him. So that should be the purpose of the Babylonians. We know from Jeremiah they're meant to bring justice, God's justice, but he's emphasized here that it's actually their own justice they bring. So how does this work? Eyes are too pure to see evil, and to look upon trouble you are not able. Why? You cannot contemplate and condone evil, surely. So why do you look upon treacherous ones, keep silent, when a wicked one swallows one more righteous than them? And I think this is Habakkuk's way of saying, we're not guiltless, we're not pure, but they are more wicked. And the wicked one swallows the one who is, in comparison with the Babylonians, a little more righteous. And so made people like fish of the sea, like a swarm without anyone ruling over it. Every one of them with a hook he brings up, he drags them with his net and gathers them with his seine. Therefore he's glad and rejoices. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his seine. For by them his portion is plumb and his food is rich. So he worships the instruments of them. I don't think Habakkuk means to imply that they're literally worshipping their instruments of war, although there's some evidence that they might have offered worship to some of their weapons. And the seine and the net are, of course, symbolic image for the ease with which they capture get a big catch of fish. Shall he therefore empty his net and continually be slaying nations unsparingly? That is where Habakkuk's complaint is heading towards. Is this meant to go on forever? That someone who doesn't care for justice at all, who worships his own instruments, who's idolatrous, should be allowed to slay nations left, right, and center. So this is my reading, and I said it's a minority reading, and you may or may not be convinced by that. You may prefer the older version, a number of people do. But I read this Habakkuk 1 as one prayer, one complaint that has three parts. An opening part, then the quotation of an oracle, and then a concluding part. And so one further reason, I think, for reading it this way for me is, complaints department, of honest. So this, I was thinking of, there's a little book by Martin Goldsmith, who is very old, but I think still alive. Wonderful missionary who's been all over the world, I think more in Asia and so on, who wrote a book, if you've got a complaint, blame God, and it's about Habakkuk, arguing that Habakkuk gives us an example that we should take all our complaints to God. This is the complaint department, God. If you can pin something on God, do it. If you can make God responsible for it, great. Because, like, if the Babylonians are responsible for this, what can you do about it? What influence will you have on the Babylonians? You can send an ambassador to them, he will not reply. But if God is responsible for it, well, he might reply, he might respond to prayer. So if you can make God responsible, that's a good move, because then the complaint might actually lead to something. I want to lead into this basically taking God as his word. Hey, I read in Jeremiah that you are responsible for this, so I'm taking this right back to you and say, what are you doing here? Is that really what you want? All this unsparing violence and no justice and so on. And I want to end on, before we could have a short break for coffee, with Habakkuk 2:1, because that's, for me, another reason why I read chapter 1 as one complaint. Because in Habakkuk 2, verse 1, this is a translation of a picture I found in my translation. At my watch I will stand, and I will station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will say about me, and what I will answer when I'm reprimanded. So within Habakkuk, we do actually have a narrative signal between what God is saying, what Habakkuk is saying, and what God is saying. So here he's saying, I finished speaking. I'm standing on where the watchmen are. The watchman is a well-known image in the Bible. References for a prophet in Jeremiah. You've got a very brief reference to the prophets being like watchmen. They are meant to see further than others. That's what a watchman does. He's high up, so when the foreign army approaches, the danger approaches, the watchman is the first to see it. And the responsibility, of course, is to warn the rest of the city. And in Jeremiah we read, that's in effect what a prophet is doing. A prophet is looking a bit further ahead, sees the danger, it's usually God, approaching, and then warns the people so they can get ready for it. And in Ezekiel, that imagery of the watchman is teased down in a lot more detail and played with in the way that Ezekiel is a watchman. And so here, Habakkuk compares himself to a watchman, and he wants to see, what is God going to say? What is going to say about me? What I've said here, and what will I answer when I'm reprimanded? This is these second two lines. They're quite controversial to translate. Some would translate what he will say to me, through me, and I settled for about me. And the last line in particular, people interpret differently, but I interpret it, many others, that Habakkuk already anticipates that he will be reprimanded. He's praying and he knows, yeah, I'm pushing it. I'm pushing the boundaries here. I'm going to get reprimanded by God. And let me see what I would answer then to that. So because we have this scene-setting moment here, but we don't have it in verse 5, I read chapter 1 as one prayer. Because I would otherwise expect even something briefly like, and the Lord answered, look, and so on. Then it would be clear that we're going back and forth. It's not always clear that we're going back and forth in the prophetic literature, so that's not a foolproof argument. But in Habakkuk, it is clear here that Habakkuk's speech has come to an end. He's now waiting for God to reply. And so that, for me, is a kind of a fourth argument for reading one. Yes. So that is basically the question, whether we're meant to read Habakkuk 1 as a dialogue between Habakkuk and God, Habakkuk speaking, God speaking, Habakkuk speaking again, or whether it's just Habakkuk speaking. This is how I read it, just Habakkuk complaining. And then chapter 2:1 sets us up for he's now waiting for the answer. What is God going to say to this complaint? Yeah, that's why. He's literally quoting God, because he's quoting Jeremiah 4 and 5. He's not quoting it in a way that you have to quote in an academic essay. He's playing around a bit with the quotation. He changes it a little bit because he wants to bring out just how bad it is what is happening here. But he uses enough of Jeremiah 5 chapter 4 and 5, to say, look, God, this is what you said. And so he quotes it, and so that's why he keeps the first person there. This is what God said. And that's why I make you responsible for this violence and disaster, because you said you were going to bring the Nebuchadnezzar. That's what you did, and see what happened. It's disaster. It's all very well for the Babylonians to destroy Nineveh. Thank you. We'll appreciate that. But now he's doing all this. No. Is that really your plan and purpose? I think for me, those 4 reasons why, but the main reason maybe is that I don't see Habakkuk responding to a reply at the end of chapter 1. I don't see him interacting with this. He's just reusing this. He's not saying, yeah, but what about this then? So that will remain a matter of interpretation. But there won't be much matter of interpretation in chapter 2, where we will get definitely God's answer.